This is the LinkedIn Data Breach Report by Zachary Berbert, Derek Long, and Michael Fuller.
All right. Thank you, Zach. Good morning, everybody. We're going to kind of summarize the beginning of our LinkedIn data breach that was occurred in 2012. Kind of summarize the points. We're going to talk about how the user credentials were compromised and what kind of an attack was used. There's a belief that it's a SQL injection attack. Some of the security standards that they were using at the time, and some of the responses that they did to the incident. We're going to cover some of that. There was a lot of cause to believe that the breach was caused to outdated security policies, and some of the standards you see today were not implemented back during this time. So we're going to start off with the analysis. We'll let Derek start off with that, and then we'll go from there.
All right, thank you. So the first thing we're going to want to look at is how did it happen? So for starters, we don't know nearly as much about this breach as we would like to, because while we have better tools and monitoring solutions implemented nowadays, back in 2012 we didn't have much or any of that. Instead, we were responding to the incident after it had happened, rather than mitigating it while it was still in progress. So, as mentioned, we suspect that the breach was by way of an SQL injection, which is to say, manipulation of the database scripting language to read information that they weren't meant to have access to. So we have disclosed that basic profile information was compromised, most importantly, of user emails and encrypted passwords. Now, the passwords were indeed encrypted, but they were encrypted weakly. So SHA-1 encryption unsalted. We'll detail why that was a problem in a little bit. But the threat actors shared the database in a Russian hacking forum, and they were all able to work together, collaborate, and crack the rest of them within a mere number of days. It's also worth noting that while there were two apparent leaks, one in 2012 and another in 2016, they were both from the same 2012 breach. So we don't know why they waited for 4 years between the two, but this could mean that we still don't know the full scope of the breach. There could be more usernames and passwords out there.
All right, thanks, Derek. So start off with the evaluation here. We're going to kind of dig a little bit into stuck with encryption. We all know all encryption is not created equal, and this is a kind of example of why it's not. They were using secure hash algorithm 1, which was at the time had been broken, and there was it was not something most companies should be using at that time. As a matter of fact, by today's standards, we have secure hash algorithm 3 family of hashes, and it's recommended to use at least SHA-256, but they recommend 512 and that is part of the SHA-3 family. But we do know that was their first problem, is they were using kind of I don't know if outdated, but just something that had been proved to have been broken. They also didn't use salting, which we know is when you add random string of characters to the hash value. So they had the password, it passes through the hash value, and then you add a bunch of characters, so it makes it harder when you use like rainbow tables and things like that for these hackers to break that password. So that was the biggest failure as far as the breach is concerned, which the security standards for them at the time were kind of outdated. The second security standard, next slide for me there, Zachary, was they only use one mode of authentication. A lot of today, as you see, two-factor authentication, which would be something like an authenticator on your phone, like Microsoft Authenticator, Google, there's a bunch of them out there. That they only used one mode back then, which probably was maybe a little bit of the standard, but it was kind of creeping in that you should start using 2 factors instead of just credentials of a password and a username. So that now they offer that as a result of the breach. Of course, they pretty much recommend it, and a lot of companies are getting to the point where it's just mandatory, especially if you work in corporations now. The other part of the response that was kind of a little bit amiss. I don't know if they just didn't really have the tools to understand what they had lost, but some people believe they really could have reacted better in the fact of maybe sending out a mandatory password reset for everybody and just explaining what happened. It was almost if they were kind of trying to keep it quiet. Or maybe they just didn't know, because there was a couple estimates that it was only 6.5 million accounts at first, but it turned out to be a lot more than that, like 160 million accounts that were breached. So they could have responded in a better way as far as maybe just sending out a blanket mandatory password reset, as opposed to just sending out to the people they knew were breached, which there was reports that only was sent out days after, and some didn't even receive that till days after they had been notified of the breach. So there's in that respect, the evaluation overall was that they could have responded better to the breach in their incident response, and maybe they lacked the tools, but they could have also maybe had two-factor authentication going, and definitely they could have upgraded their password hashing algorithm for sure. But those are the main points of what led to this breach of their database holding the user credentials.
All right. So for the recommendations of what we should do at our company to keep it changed is just three major points. Keeping modern. So what this accounts to is just modernizing the security policies. As we talked about, they were using an older SHA hashing, and they didn't hash properly or salt their passwords at the time. That is kind of the standard norm now for companies. So as long as we keep our policies modern, that'll improve upon that point. Second was account security. So we talked about how they didn't have multi-factor authentication of any form at the time, and after the breach, they implemented it. As long as we, as a company, required as a mandatory system, it should keep our users safe and all the user credentials safe, and makes it a lot harder for an account to properly be hacked with that two-factor authentication. Hazard management. So this was in regards to their responding to it. As a company, we can do a better job of responding to it. We touched briefly on it, but initially it was thought to be 6.5 million accounts that were breached, and there were emails that after a certain amount of time got sent out to those accounts asking them to change their password, but only those accounts. 4 years down the line, it turns out 167 million accounts were affected. And so as a company, what we can do to be different is we can actually require a mandatory password change if we suspect any security breach. And we can do it to all accounts instead of just the ones we think are affected. By doing this, we have a system in place that'll minimize any damage done and any loss of security. By focusing on these three areas, we can learn from this breach and improve our security. In conclusion, the outdated security policy is probably most to blame for the breach. The fact that they had used an older system along with not properly salting or hashing their passwords led to an easy access breach, along with the non-multi-factor authentication. Their poor response, so the fact that they only sent emails and didn't even mandatory require the password change, just sent out emails requesting that users should change their password, led to the larger issue since they didn't know the full scope of the breach. As a matter of fact, we still don't know if that's all the accounts. And by using this information, we can learn from this breach, improve our security, and make it so that we are less prone to being attacked. And that was the LinkedIn Data Breach Report.